So imagine a 32-year-old postal worker, right? He suddenly just quits his completely stable job.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and then he drains his family's entire life savings to buy this massive haul of tropical fish aquarium.
Good people fizz, of course.
Right. And then he announces that he's about to set off to bike 3,100 miles across the country.
That is quite the pivot.
It's wild. He's absolutely convinced he's this visionary genius on the verge of making millions and that the normal rules of society simply, no longer apply to him.
Yeah.
And this isn't just some quirky anecdote or like a standard midlife crisis. It's a profound, devastating glitch in the human operating system.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the Psychology Undergrad. If you are listening to this, you are probably pulling a late-night study session right alongside us, fueled by way too much caffeine and, well, an intense curiosity about how the human mind actually works.
We've all been there.
Totally. Tonight, we are doing a deep dive into the incredibly heavy but undeniably fascinating reality of Chapter 8 in our Abnormal Psych textbook, which covers mood disorders and suicide.
Yeah, and to really understand these phenomena, we have to kind of strip away the colloquial use of these terms.
Right, because people use them so casually.
Exactly. We throw around words like depressed or manic to describe, a bad week or a sudden rush of energy after a coffee. But the clinical reality is entirely different.
It's a whole other level.
It really is. We are talking about complete fundamental shifts in how a human being interprets reality, how they view morality, and how they perceive their literal place in the universe.
So heavy.
It is. So we're going to explore what these extremes actually look like in practice, unpack the psychological and biological theories driving them, and examine treatments from talk therapy to, well, literally rewiring the brain with electricity.
Which is still mind-blowing to me.
Right. And finally, we'll take a frank, objective look at the crisis of suicide.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start by looking at the extremes themselves, right?
Yep.
Like the actual clinical presentation out in the real world.
Yeah, the case studies are always the most illuminating part.
They really are. Take the case of Billy from the text. He's this 20-year-old first-generation college student.
Right, the guy with the major identity crisis.
Exactly. He is completely paralyzed by anxiety about his academic performance. He originally wanted to return to his rural hometown to teach, but that dream has just collapsed under all this pressure and these conflicting values.
It's a classic undergrad struggle, but magnified intensely. Did they mention his score on the BDI too?
They did. When they gave him the Beck Depression Inventory too, that 21-item self-report measure we use for symptom severity, his score was a 35.
Oh, wow, a 35.
Yeah. Considering anything over a 28 indicates severe depression, Billy is in, profound distress.
Absolutely.
He's gained significant weight, he can't sleep, he has zero energy, and his concentration is just entirely shattered. But I think the really fascinating part of the diagnostic process here is how people actually communicate this distress to professionals.
That is such a crucial point.
Yeah.
Because that communication varies wildly depending on your cultural background and your individual psychology.
Right.
There's this Montreal researcher, Lawrence Kiermaier, who studied this extensively. He looked at how patients in primary care settings actually express their depression. And he identified this specific profile he calls psychologizers.
Psychologizers. I love that term. I always think of it this way. Think of a psychologizer as someone who speaks the language of emotions rather than the language of the body.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, if you ask them what's wrong, they'll articulate their internal state. They'll say, I feel worthless, or I feel this crushing sense of guilt, or I'm consumed by profound sadness.
Right. But here is where Kiermaier's findings get really interesting. He found that only about 15% of depressed primary care patients in Canada actually fit that psychologizer profile.
Wait, really? Only 15%?
Just 15. The vast majority of people, especially in medical settings, actually emphasize somatic symptoms.
So physical stuff.
Exactly. Physical symptoms. They go to the doctor for chronic headaches or these mysterious stomach aches, severe fatigue, or persistent back pain.
That's wild. So the psychological pain is literally translating into physical agony.
It is. It completely reorients how we have to think about diagnosis. You expect a depressed patient to walk in weeping about their life, but they are far more likely to walk in complaining that their head has been pounding for a month and their body feels like lead.
That makes total sense, especially across different cultures where talking about emotions isn't as normalized.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then we swing to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. Let's go back to the case of Mr. W., our postal worker with the tropical fish obsession.
Right, the 3,000-mile bike ride.
Yeah. His state of mania is characterized by this dangerous, impulsive euphoria. He was bursting with frantic energy, having this massive flight of ideas, and making these grandiose, reality-detached plans.
The grandiosity is always so striking.
It really is. But the detail that really highlights the severity of mania for me is the complete moral disinhibition.
Oh, yeah. The hypersexuality.
Yes. During his evaluation, Mr. W. casually informed his therapist that along his cross-country bike route, he planned to know people. And he specifically clarified, know in the biblical
Oh,
sense.
wow. Yeah, that phrase, in the biblical sense, it perfectly captures the total stripping away of standard moral and social
As
inhibitions.
the brakes are just totally cut.
Exactly. The regulatory mechanisms in the prefrontal cortex that keep our impulses in check, the parts of our brain that weigh consequences and ethical frameworks and social norms, they're completely overridden.
Just offline.
Basically, yeah, the person is flooded with this unfounded elation that feels incredibly powerful and righteous to them, but it usually leaves this massive trail of financial, social, and emotional destruction in their wake.
So seeing these extreme behavioral shifts, I mean, Billy completely unable to get out of bed and carrying the weight of the world, and then Mr. W abandoning his family to bike across the continent. The inevitable question is why?
Right. Why does the mind do that?
Exactly. What are the underlying psychological mechanisms driving this software glitch?
Well, one of the foundational attempts to explain this comes from psychoanalytic theory. We have to talk about Freud.
Good old Freud.
Always. So in 1917, he published Mourning and Melancholia, and he proposed that the seeds of depression are actually planted by childhood loss.
Okay, loss.
Yeah. When we experience the loss of a loved one, whether through actual death or even just a perceived withdrawal of their affection, we unconsciously interject that person.
Interject. I use an analogy to remember this one. Think of interjection like literally swallowing the ghost of the person you lost.
Swallowing the ghost. I like that.
Yeah, because human relationships are so complex, we almost always harbor some unconscious anger or resentment toward the people we love, especially if we feel abandoned by them.
Right, which makes sense.
So once you've internalized or interjected that person, the anger you felt toward them has nowhere to go but inward. It gets directed right at yourself.
And that creates this deeply internalized burden of moral failure. Freud argued that the depressed person feels an intense, crushing guilt for real or imagined sins against that lost person.
So it's not just sadness.
No, the depression is an active, punishing moral judgment against the self. It is literally anger turned completely inward.
Wow. Okay, so moving from the unconscious depths of Freud to more conscious thought patterns, we have to look at cognitive theory, right? Specifically, Aaron Beck.
Yes, Beck is monumental here. He identified what he called the negative triad. He noticed that depressed individuals hold deeply pessimistic views of three specific domains: themselves, the world, and their future.
The trifecta of misery.
Basically.
Hmm.
And these views are maintained by specific cognitive biases, things like arbitrary inferences, selective abstraction, and overgeneralization.
I have a visual for how these cognitive biases operate.
Let's hear it.
Imagine wearing a pair of dark, heavily smudged sunglasses. No matter how bright and beautiful the sun is outside, the filter of your mind only allows the dark, distorted information to actually pass through.
Right.
So, like, if someone compliments your presentation but offers one tiny piece of constructive feedback, the sunglasses just filter out all the praise. You solely process the critique, and then you overgeneralize that single data point to mean you are entirely incompetent and totally worthless.
That is a perfect analogy. And that cognitive filter inevitably fuels a profound sense of hopelessness, which connects directly to Martin Seligman's theory of learned helplessness.
Oh, the dog studies.
Yeah. They are foundational, albeit pretty controversial animal studies.
Hmm.
Seligman demonstrated that dogs exposed to inescapable electric shocks eventually just stopped trying to escape, even when a clear exit was provided later on.
They just gave up.
Exactly. And when applied to humans, the theory suggests that experiencing adverse, uncontrollable events basically teaches a person that they are powerless. They become passive, they lose all motivation, and they essentially give up on trying to affect their environment at all.
Okay, wait. I actually have to push back on this exact point.
Okay.
Because honestly, it's the most confusing part of the cognitive model for me. If someone genuinely believes they're totally helpless and have zero control over their environment, Why are they drowning in so much guilt?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Shouldn't a state of true helplessness mean you recognize it is objectively not your fault?
What's fascinating here is that you've just identified the depressive paradox.
The depressive paradox.
Yes, it is entirely counterintuitive, but it is a hallmark of severe depression. Individuals feel completely stripped of agency, yet they simultaneously hold themselves completely morally responsible for all their perceived failures.
That makes no logical sense.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
They essentially say, I have absolutely no power to fix my life, and it is entirely my fault that my life is broken. It is this brutal, inescapable cognitive trap.
Oh, man. It's the equivalent of being locked inside a steel cage and viciously blaming yourself for your inability to literally walk through solid metal.
Exactly.
But feeling that immense guilt, being trapped in that cognitive loop, it isn't just a psychological illusion. It takes a massive physical toll. So what is actually happening to the physical architecture and the chemistry of the brain when this is going on?
Well, this is where we transition to the biological mechanisms or the hardware.
Yeah.
And we have to start with our genetic blueprint.
Right.
Bipolar disorder, for instance, is highly heritable. Twin studies show up to an 85% concordance rate.
85%.
Yeah, which strongly indicates that genetics account for a massive portion of the variance in whether someone develops these extreme mood swings.
However, having the genes doesn't automatically guarantee you get the disorder, right? We use the diathesis stress model to understand this interaction. So you might have a genetic vulnerability, the diathesis. For example, the text mentions researchers focusing heavily on the short variant of the 5-HT-TLPR gene.
The serotonin transporter gene, yeah.
Right. So think of having this short variant like building a house with a slightly weaker foundation. In perfect weather, the house stands perfectly fine for decades.
Sure.
But when the environmental earthquake hits like severe childhood trauma or chronic stress, that foundation gives way, and that triggers the mood disorder.
That's spot on. The environment acts as the catalyst that activates that biological vulnerability. And when we examine the neurochemistry during these episodes, we're really moving way beyond the simplistic idea of just a basic chemical imbalance.
Yeah, that term is so outdated.
It really is. Modern neuroimaging offers incredible specificity now. There's this researcher out of Toronto, Jeffrey Meyer, who conducted a breakthrough study focusing on an enzyme called MAOA.
Okay, MAOA. That's an enzyme responsible for metabolizing or basically breaking down monoamines like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, right?
Exactly. And Meyer's neuroimaging revealed something wild. In the brains of individuals with untreated major depression, the levels of this MAOA enzyme are elevated by a staggering 35%.
35%, that is huge.
It is.
So to picture what 35% more MAOA is doing, imagine an overactive vacuum cleaner just running loose in the brain's synapses.
A vacuum cleaner.
Yeah. It is aggressively sucking up all the joy-producing, mood-regulating chemicals before the brain even has a chance to utilize them. The biological hardware is actively starving itself of its own vital resources.
That is a terrifying but accurate way to picture it.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. When we look at a biological reality, that stark and overactive enzyme aggressively depleting serotonin, it kind of forces a major philosophical question.
Okay, let's hear it.
Does this biological proof invalidate the psychological pain? Like, if my brain is just a bag of chemicals and my MAOA is simply too high, do my thoughts or my interjected grief or my moral guilt even matter?
That is such a profound question.
Yeah.
And the synthesis we find in abnormal psychology is that biology and psychology are really just describing the exact same human experience, but in two different languages.
Two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They are locked in a bidirectional feedback loop. Severe psychological stress literally alters the physical structure and chemistry of the brain. And when that chemistry is altered, it generates those dark cognitive biases we talked about. You simply cannot separate the physical neurochemistry of sadness from the conscious experience of it.
So the hardware and the software are just completely intertwined.
Deeply intertwined.
Yeah.
And recognizing that dictates exactly how we approach treatment. If the foundation is cracked and the vacuum is running in overdrive, we need interventions that address both sides.
Right.
Psychologically, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is designed to directly target Beck's negative triad. The therapist works systematically with the client to essentially take off those dark sunglasses, challenging the evidence behind their overgeneralizations.
And then building on that foundation is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT,
Oh, yeah. Yes, exactly.
which is specifically utilized to prevent relapse. MBCT introduces this really cool concept called metacognitive
It's
awareness.
so powerful.
It is. It's the learned ability to step back from the machinery of your own mind. You learn to recognize that your thoughts are merely mental events, not objective facts or moral truths.
Right.
So when the thought, I am a failure, arises, metacognitive awareness allows you to observe that thought passing by like a cloud in the sky rather than internalizing it as a permanent storm.
I love the cloud analogy,
Yeah.
but when talk therapy and standard psychopharmacology fail to alleviate the symptoms, psychiatry sometimes has to turn to powerful biological interventions.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, the most historically infamous being electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT.
Oh man, the history of this one is wild.
Its origins are shocking, pun absolutely intended.
Nice one.
Two Italian physicians, Serletti and Bini, developed the modern concept in the early 20th century. And they actually got the idea after observing pigs in a slaughterhouse.
Pigs?
Yeah, the pigs were being shocked with electricity to induce seizures before slaughter. And these doctors hypothesized they could apply a similar electric current to the human brain to induce a full epileptic seizure.
Hearing that origin story makes it sound absolutely medieval, like Frankenstein stuff.
It really does. But the mechanism behind why it works today is fascinating. When modern unilateral ECT is administered, and this is safely under anesthesia and with muscle relaxants, now that induced seizure acts like a profound system reset.
A hard reboot for the brain.
Exactly. We now know it floods the brain with neurotransmitters and actually stimulates neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons, particularly in the hippocampus. For a patient who is catatonic or severely suicidal, that massive biological reset can literally save their life within a matter of days.
That's incredible. And then for an even more targeted modern approach, the text talks about deep brain stimulation, or DBS.
Yes, researchers like Helen Mayberg in Toronto pioneered this. Through neuroimaging, they identified that a specific region of the brain, the subgenual cingulate region, known as Brotman areal 25, is metabolically overactive in people with treatment-resistant depression.
So it's like a node in the depression network that is just stuck in the on position.
Perfectly said. So neurosurgeons literally drill into the skull and implant tiny electrodes directly into this region.
I always conceptualize DBS as a highly targeted $250,000 pacemaker for the brain's sadness center.
That's a very accurate, very expensive pacemaker.
Right. It utilizes steady, precise electrical pulses to disrupt that pathological hyperactivity, regulating the rhythm of the depression network. It's an incredibly invasive procedure, obviously, but it really highlights the severity of the illness.
It really does.
We are willing to drill into the human skull because mood disorders are not just painful, they're potentially fatal. Which, unfortunately, brings us to the heaviest but probably the most necessary topic of our study session today.
Suicide.
Yeah.
Dealing with suicide requires dismantling some really pervasive and dangerous myths. The most prominent myth out there is the belief that people who openly talk about suicide won't actually follow through.
Like it's just attention-seeking.
Right, which is so wrong. The clinical data definitively proves this false.
Yeah.
At least 75% of individuals who take their own lives have explicitly communicated their intentions beforehand.
Wow. 75%.
Yes, it is frequently a desperate cry for intervention. And to understand the psychology of someone in that state of crisis, the field relies heavily on the work of suicidologist Edwin Schneidman.
Schneidman. He coined a term that I think perfectly captures the internal experience. Psychic, exactly. He defines psychic as an intense, unendurable, intolerable psychological pain. It is literally an agony of the mind.
Agony is the right word.
And crucially, Schneidman didn't view suicide merely as a symptom of a mental illness. He framed it as a highly conscious, deliberate effort to seek a solution. When the psyche becomes completely unbearable, suicide is viewed by the sufferer as the only logical way to turn off the consciousness that is experiencing the pain.
It's a profound way to look at it. And while Schneidman focused on the individual's internal pain, sociologist Emil Durkheim expanded the lens. He looked at how a person's relationship to society and morality influences suicide.
Durkheim's typologies, right?
Yeah. Durkheim categorized suicide into three distinct types. First is egoistic suicide, which occurs when an individual is profoundly alienated and disconnected from the social supports and meaning structures of their community.
They just feel completely isolated.
Exactly. Second is anomic suicide, This is triggered by a sudden catastrophic disorientation in a person's way of life.
Like the example in the textbook.
Right, the harrowing example of the Guarani Indians in Brazil. They suffered massive suicide rates after being forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. Their entire societal and cultural framework was suddenly annihilated.
Just stripped away overnight.
Yeah.
And then the third type Durkheim identified is altruistic suicide, which is entirely intertwined with morality, religion, and societal duty.
This one is always so complex to study.
It is. This occurs when an individual willingly sacrifices themselves for what they believe is the greater good of society or a higher moral calling. Like the most vivid historical example is the self-immolation of Buddhist monks protesting the Vietnam War. They viewed their self-destruction not as an escape from pain, but as a profound moral act.
Right, and that intersection of morality and survival cuts both ways.
How so?
Well, while moral duty can drive altruistic suicide, a strong moral compass is also one of the most powerful protective factors we have. When clinicians assess a patient's risk, they specifically evaluate their reasons for living. The research strongly indicates that holding deep moral or religious objections to suicide acts as an incredible anchor. Even when the psychic is extremely severe, the internal belief that taking one's life is fundamentally wrong can physically hold a person back from the edge.
That makes a lot of sense, an internal anchor. But we also have to examine how modern societal pressures actively generate that lethal psyche in the first place.
Oh, absolutely.
The perfectionism social disconnection model, or PSDM, perfectly illustrates this. This model focuses on interpersonal perfectionists, individuals who have this desperate, rigid need to appear absolutely flawless to the outside world.
We see a lot of this in undergrads, actually.
Oh, totally. We all know someone like this.
Yeah.
So when these individuals experience a deeply public humiliation, say, severe cyberbullying or a massive public failure, the discrepancy between their need for perfection and their exposed flaw creates a catastrophic psychological fracture.
Right, they feel entirely exposed. And they believe that because their imperfection has been witnessed, they are fundamentally unlovable.
Exactly, which leads to total social disconnection. They alienate themselves because they cannot bear to be seen, and that results in an overwhelming, lethal sense of hopelessness.
It's a tragic downward spiral.
It really is. So as we pack up our highlighters and look at the big picture of Chapter 8, what are we really looking at here?
A lot of heavy material.
Truly. We've traced the journey from the crushing interjected guilt of Billy's depression to the dangerous moral disinhibition of Mr. W's mania. We've seen how genetic weak foundations and overactive MAOA vacuums physically alter our brain chemistry, generating those cognitive sunglasses that warp our reality.
The hardware and the software.
Exactly. And we've explored the profound societal ties from anomic disorientation to moral anchors that can either push a human being to the brink or pull them back to safety. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that mood disorders are this highly complex, inseparable collision of biology, psychology, and society.
They are. And looking at that collision, it leaves us with a critical lingering thought for you to ponder before your exam.
Lay it on us.
Well, we've established today that having reasons to live and strong moral objections can actually protect a mind in the midst of absolute crisis. So if psychological pain, that unbearable psychache, is powerful enough to override our basic biological survival instincts, how do we, both as individuals and as a whole society, actively construct meaning strong enough to act as an impenetrable shield against it?